to it. And I was just trying to give him some understanding about the global timeline of things. But what I sense is that with so much shifting, it's really important to reorient around value and what is really most important. Because those are the things that move past chaos, they move past moments, and they move through time. There's things just that are valuable to us that if we lock our life around that, I think it will stand the test of time.
Yeah, I agree. So the question that we would maybe like to just put out there for us today is, if love is the overarching value of the community, where does love begin? How does one, do you just kind of conjure up, I'm going to love, or is there a genesis of love that that we can look to for where love begins that journey, begins that launch? And the scripture that comes to mind as that acute insight into where one goes to get love, where one goes to activate that energy of love within the heart, where one goes for that, is one that Jesus often quoted. It predates him, by a millennia and a half or so. And it's a quote that Moses gives to the children of Israel, the next generation, as they're embarking on the conquest of a land boundary.
Yes.
Right? So they're wandering, they don't have a land boundary, and he's like, you're getting ready to step into a place, vineyards you've never planted, houses you've never built, cisterns that you never dug. And he says, here's the thing that you need to know about all of that. What God desires from us is love. Now, here's where that begins. And then he says, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. The verb there is to listen. That before we can love, we have to listen to where the origination of that love is coming from.
Yes.
And he says to him, God brought you out of Egypt. God loved you, rescued you. And from the posture of hearing about that story that your parents told, listening to that again and again, it fills up the reservoir of love within your heart so that you can pour that back out. Which really, one of the first values the first value that we're going to talk about underneath the meta value of love is this value of listening. Listening and hearing both what God has to say, as well as listening into what our neighbors are saying. It's hard, virtually impossible to, how are we doing over here, brother?
I'm making sure that audio is working. I'm getting texts from the community saying that there's an audio problem. Can you guys hear us okay? So if you could let us know now, I think we fixed it, but I want to make sure that we're good. So
do we need to pick up somewhere? Were we not?
Let's see. Everybody good? Let's see. Well, people are actually talking like it's good now. So
okay. So as it relates to the way forward to love, both to love God and to love our neighbor, it begins in a posture of listening.
That's good.
We really can't effectively love our neighbor unless we listen to them.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense because as someone involved in a relationship, Jeff, I do know that if you do not learn to listen, I'm not sure they hear your love. Listening certainly follows love.
What's that the little YouTube clip of the little boy, listen, Linda, listen?
Listen, Linda, listen, Linda, listen, Linda. If you haven't seen that, you should Google that YouTube clip. Listen,
he's in
Linda.
trouble. He's 5 years old or something, and he's in trouble with his mom, 4 years old, and he's trying to tell his mom that she needs to listen to what he's saying. And so this idea of listening is what we really want to unpack and talk about, how for Lighthouse it has been a significant value, experience, way in which we process going forward. We frequently will say when we're talking about listening that we don't want to, and we choose not to react to situations, but to respond to God's voice. And so instead of being reactionary, the pandemic happens. How do we react to that? Say, let's stop, let's listen, and let's respond to what God is saying in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And for for anything. And if I were to maybe, give, like, for me, as it relates to Lighthouse. Just a little bit of a narrative here, so you can see how that has played out in some of our story.
Yes.
When I first came to San Francisco in 2003, the first thing that we did as a community is we called them sacred assemblies.
Okay.
And we went on a 40-day fast. This was in September of 2003, a 40-day fast. Where everyone took a day or took some time, and then we'd gather once a week in the evenings to pray together, and we would just listen. Pray and listen, pray and listen. We came around after that, and in the spring of 2004, during Lent, we felt like we should do it again because we experienced so many baptisms. I think we had like 60 or 70 baptisms following that 40-day fast. And so we came around the spring, we're like, let's do it again. We did it. We did the fast again. Well, while we're fasting, I had learned that the house next door to 252 Broad Street was being used as a human trafficking house. So they were bringing in Chinese immigrants, and they had upwards of 17 people living in this house. They had them out in the back in like little sheds.
Oh my gosh.
They had taken like a sledgehammer and broke up the concrete in the garage and just tapped toilets into the sewer line.
Gosh.
And they were just out exposed in the open. They had put bars on the inside of the house. And I learned that this was going on, and it just infuriated me. Started praying about that during that time. Well, the city came in, shut the house down, and then the house went up for sale on the market. And I was like, we need to purchase this house, and we need to redeem it.
Wow.
We need to use it for something good. So it was interesting. We were praying for it, praying about it, and I was told that the seller would not sell to a church.
Amazing.
The owner
course.
was determined not to sell to a church. I was teaching a class on prayer at a college, and I had just got the text right before I walked into the class, and my real estate agent says to me, he won't sell to us. And I got up in front of the class, and I was so angry. And I remember praying in front of this class. We're talking about prayer. I remember praying in front of this class, just crying. I was like, how is it, how can the heathen rage? I was just crying out to God. It's not right that this house gets to be used to traffic people.
Right.
And here we are wanting to redeem it for something good. And and I'm like, God, you can change his heart. And I just sat there. The room got really quiet. And we're in this posture, just kind of listening. The class is listening, and I'm crying. The phone rings in class.
Wow, same moment.
I look down at my phone, and I'm going, oh my goodness. Class, this is the real estate agent. Please hold on a second.
Wow.
So I pick up the phone. I was like, hey, Rock. He's like, hey. The owner just now called me. He's willing to sell.
Amazing. During class.
During the prayer, like
Unreal.
the follow-up prayer. So we purchased that building, and we started fixing it up. We're going to kind of really dig in roots here in the Bayview. So we start planning. We bring in a speaker. This is in the bring a speaker in to speak. His name is Morton Bustard. He comes in to speak.
Wow.
We've been gutting this house. We're preparing. We're like, this is where we're going to build our community. He walks in the first night of Friday night. He stands up. He does not know the church. It's his first time to be there.
So good.
Doesn't know anything about what's going on. I had just picked him up at the airport. We drive in. I said, hey, if you want to go change your shirt and get dressed, you can go into the house next door. But we're planning on expanding here. He walks in. Before he preaches, before he says hello, before he says, I was in the house next door and sensed the Spirit of God speak to me and just say this word to you. And then he looked at me and he said, and if Pastor Jeff feels differently, obviously go with what he's saying, but I have to say this before I teach because it's burning in my heart. And then he said, I see, and had a vision, and he described a building that was elongated. It had a fountain. You would turn the key. It was a tall building. He describes all of this.
Goodness.
And he says, this is not your home. God is going to relocate you to another place. And his last words were, pack your bags. It's going to happen quick. That was on a Friday. Immediately, my heart's just postured. We're coming out of the 40-day fast. I'm like, okay, well, whatever God's saying. I didn't know what it was. Monday, the same realtor calls me. He said, hey, I'm driving up Sutter Street, and I see this building that's for sale. Jeff, it has the name Lighthouse written all over it. I just feel like this is for you. And I was like, oh my goodness. Well, 70 days later, we were in here. We did 5 property transactions in 70 days.
70 days.
And 2 of those were commercial properties. I mean, it was and Rock just kept going, I can't believe this is happening. And the week before we purchased, which would have been December, we got the keys to the property December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2004. The week before, I get a phone call from the bank. They're like, we just looked at your financials. We can't loan you the money. You don't have enough money.
Always
you don't have cash flow. And I would try to get out of the deal. We had already sold our properties, the church and the house. I'm trying to I call Rock up. I'm like, I don't know what to do. I said, we're going to lose. At that point, we had already put about $500, maybe $700,000 down on this. We tried to call the owner, the seller of 1337 Sutter. He won't back up.
Wow.
He's like, nope, nope. So I'm like, what do we do? He says, I have a friend that will loan you $1.5 million on a gentleman's handshake.
That's amazing.
And then we'll go ahead and get the loan after that. It was one miracle after another. Now I'm saying all that to Lighthouse to say, like, it was, our posture was, what's God saying?
It's listening.
Yeah.
The listening came before anything else.
Yep.
What is God saying? And then, of course, one of those prayer mechanisms we use is, so what is God saying?
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do about it? And so the listening value of, we're going to listen and follow the voice of God, and then God shows up and gives a prophetic word. Oh my gosh. Jeff, hearing. The thing is that I know there are seasons in your life, there's been seasons in my life, and I'm sure for those who are watching now, there's seasons in your life that you've heard clearly this compulsion and voice of God. There may be other seasons where you're walking through seasons where you're like, I don't know, does God even speak anymore? But I am here to encourage all of you to say that God is still able to speak to you, and you're able to hear.
Yeah, for sure. And it doesn't, like, a lot of times it requires a certain amount of, like, an intentionality and an intensity.
Yes.
Of silence, like intentional silence and quieting everything, the things that are creating the loudest cacophony around us, muting them so that you can hear, what the Spirit is tugging you toward, hear what the Spirit is saying to you. And that's why frequently in with the early people of faith, it involved like fasting, prayer, meditation, certain disciplines like solitude, getting away so that you could hear what God was saying and not just react, in anger, react out of fear, react because you have a chip on your shoulder, but learn how to really regenerate your heart around that voice that is sustaining all of creation and sustains us.
Yeah, I've heard it said that God often speaks the loudest when we are the quietest. And that's what you're saying, is that there's this need for us to posture ourselves to hear.
Yeah.
In fact, aren't we going to call the church to prayer in this season?
Yeah. So Wednesday is Lent.
Yes.
Begins Lent, and then for the next 40 days leading up to Easter, it's been a part of the tradition of the church going back, I think, to the 3rd century, the 3rd century, that the church has given itself over during those 40 days leading up to Easter to prayer, to prayerful consideration, sacrificing something, taking something that you put aside as you hone your ears around God and His voice. So yes, and we'll be calling the church to a time specifically within Lent of 3 days of prayer and fasting.
Jeff, could you give some commentary on something for me? All right, so this is going to put Jeff on the spot.
This is on the spot.
This is what you call, is this extemporaneous?
Extemporaneous.
Because there was something this morning when I was thinking about this listening posture. I immediately went to Genesis 15 and Genesis 22.
Oh, yeah,
And I
yeah.
went to Genesis 15, and if you're not familiar with that story, it's where Abraham and Sarah received a promise they would have an heir. And in Genesis 15, chapter 15, verse 4, it says, "And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This one shall not be your heir, but the one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Then he brought him outside and said, Look now toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said, So shall your descendants be." Now, this is the promise of the son that would be born. We know this. We talked about the story in different contexts about how Abraham and Sarah were really too old to have, and there's this seeming moment of their time had passed, and there was not going to be a suitable heir. And then God gave a promise. Then you go all the way over to Genesis chapter 22, and so then they've been through a lot of things. So we had the laughing moment, you've had the angel visit, you've had a lot of things happen. Then you get to Genesis chapter 22, and so understand now. So that he was given a promise,
Right,
and it came to pass.
Right.
I mean, Sarah
Right.
had a child.
right.
They named him.
Isaac
They grew him.
becomes a young man.
They nurtured him.
Yep.
And then in 22, it says, now it came to pass after things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, this was interesting to me because it feels like, Jeff, that there are moments in my life that you've been given a promise, and then you receive the promise, and you're like, so this is it.
Yeah.
This is exactly how the narrative is going to go. This is exactly how this story is going to unfold, and you've got it compartmentalized and fixed up, and it all will be well. And often we hear the voice of God when it's in the promise category. Like, oh yeah, that's God. Because God's given me new kids, and God's given me raises, and God's given me jobs, and God's given me houses and land, and God's giving me. And then God also speaks when he goes, you're also going to have to trust me. And I never like those moments when you have to trust even when you're hearing something you don't want to hear. And then in this story, Abraham, this is interesting to me because when you get to verse number, they tie the donkey up, they walk up the mountain, chapter 22. He puts Isaac on the altar. I mean, at each point, I was narrating as a father, going, if I've ever tried to hear God, I'm trying to hear God now. Because wait a minute, hold on, I'm about to sacrifice the very thing that you gave me. I'm about to release and let go and give up all the things that I thought you had for me. And I'm like leaning in. And there are moments in my life, Jeff, that I have leaned in. And it's usually when there's pressure, when there's difficulty, when there's frustration, when there's anxiety, when things aren't turning out like I want them to turn out, I'm like leaning in. I'm like, okay, God, I want to hear. And I can see Abraham in my mind as he's going up this mountain at each step. When he's walking the donkey, he's like, okay, God, I'm listening. And as he continues up the mountain, he's like, I'm listening. And he doesn't hear until verse number 11. The angel said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for I know that you now fear God, since you've not withheld your son. Then Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and then God performed a miracle.
Yeah.
But Jeff, how often do we struggle hearing God and wanting to believe that this story is shifting in a way that I hadn't planned, but it is still God. God often surprises us with his voice.
Yeah.
And I have been through seasons in my life where I'm like, this is not what I wanted, this is not what I planned. But I can just see, I was seeing some of you out there in your life today, and you're not getting the news you want to get. You're not getting the news flash that you hope to get. But God is like, still in that. God is still in that. God is still in the process between when we hear the word and we act on the word. When we hear and when we do, God's still in that transition. My old friend Tia Tenney, the bishop in my life back in the day, he used to say, when you can't track God, you have to trust God. And I think that often when you're in a season where you're listening for God and you've heard something, And then it's this moment of transition, right? Where you're like, this is not going quite like I planned. That's where you have to trust.
Yeah.
And you just have to trust. What say you about all that? That's what I want to know.
I think you said a lot.
Is there anything to say about that?
I think you said a lot. Whenever I hear this story now, I always think, I think about the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. It was probably his best book, Fear and Trembling, but it's that whole moment when Abraham hears, and it's the process through, and he calls it the night of faith. He says Abraham becomes the night of faith. That there is this, that he says very few people can get to, and he says there's two movements in that. The first movement is infinite resignation. Like enormous sacrifice and infinite resignation. And he says when Abraham says, when God says, take your son, it says he woke up early. And he says this is insight into where Abraham's true values are. Like he loves his son, but God trumps everything in his life. And he wakes up early the next morning. He doesn't ask a question. He doesn't debate it. And Soren Kierkegaard will actually come in the book. He comes in and he says, when I read this, I realize I'm just not the person of faith that I long to be, but I'm not. So that's the first movement is infinite resignation. And here's the part that you get to when he gets to the mountain. He says the second part of faith that is the biggest leap is, it's not infinite resignation, but it is the absurdity of the return. The absurdity of the return, that Abraham goes, it's absurd to say this, but God will raise this boy up because he promised that everything was going to come through him. And so a lot of times we're asking the question around, why is God going through all of this? Why does God ask Abraham to do this? Is it, is he trying to test his love or whatever? And there's most Jewish scholars would say there's even a bigger movement at work, because all the world that Abraham comes from, the Ur of the Chaldees, everything is about sacrificing your firstborn. That you please the fertility gods when you kill your firstborn, and then you get a bunch of kids, you get everything that you want. And God is illustrating something both to Abraham and to the future progeny, that I do not want human sacrifices. That is not my way. You do not kill your firstborn. I want you to have. I want it, the absurdity of the return. I want it to be returned to you. But Abraham just had the faith of it's just going to happen. And I think this is where a lot of us get stuck in that scarcity mentality, where we're not stepping into. And as you pointed out, I think beautifully, there is that flow of God's voice is a part of all of this, from go sacrifice to don't. And that's the only words he has. He doesn't have, walk up this way, do this. I'm with you. It's going to be all right, buddy. You're going to make it. Doesn't have any of that. All of that, the walk is always faith.
This is why I love to bring up things that Jeff did not know I was going to bring up and just pitch it out there and see what he says. Because there's not many people I know that after having me said that story would have said, it reminds me of a Danish philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard, and in his book, and then he goes, no one else does this. Folks, that is the genius of Jeff. But
I'm sure Rickard will appreciate the fact that I'm bringing out.
Do you love that
Soren
Danish
Kierkegaard.
philosopher? But that's the absurdity of the return. That's a great, and people get stuck, Jeff, between.
Right. Yeah. I talking about sons, I think, knowing that we were going to talk about this today, I reached out to Jed this morning. I was like, hey, do you mind if I share the little story that happened with you when you heard the voice of God for the first time? And he's like, oh yeah, do that. I remember Jed was struggling with his grades in school, and not to get into all of that, but he just felt like he was not going to get a scholarship. He's 17.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get the scholarship. I'm not going to get to college. My life. And he said, I just kept feeling like I was a failure. He said, no matter how hard I tried with school, no matter how much I studied, I would stay up till 2, 3 in the morning, get up at 6, go to school. He said, I just wasn't. I couldn't compete at that, and at that academic race. And he said one night I'd stayed up several nights. One night about 2:00 in the morning, he said, I just threw my book down. He said, I just started sobbing, crying. He said, I just kept saying over and over, I'm a failure, I'm a failure, I'm a failure. I'll never do it. My whole life's just going to be a waste. I can't do it. And he said, in that moment, he said, I just got down on my knees and I was like, okay, so I'm a failure academically, so I don't achieve this, I don't achieve that, but I've got to hear you speak. I just need to hear your voice. He said, then I went really quiet and I'm like, he said, I'm crying, I'm listening, nothing.
So good.
Listening, nothing. He said, and then I lifted my heads up and I'm like, come on!
You can do it.
You know, I said, I looked up at a book. He was in my
my
office.
gosh.
He said, I looked up and there was a book. And he said, it was almost like this book, the binding on it said Upside Down Kingdom. He said, it was almost like it was just highlighted. Like, grab that book. He said, I just knew it. He said, I reached up and grabbed the book. And he said, I just opened it. And it was a paraphrase. He said, I opened it and right there was a paraphrase of Matthew chapter 6.
Goodness.
Don't worry about what college you're going to, don't worry about what college you're going to go to, what career you're going to have, what clothes you're going to wear,
Yes,
whether you
come
fit
on.
in or don't fit
Come
in.
on.
But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And he said, I knew God spoke to me. Now, if you look at his right arm, he's got Matthew.
He does.
Matthew
That's
6
right. That's
tattooed
right.
on his arm. We were talking about,
That's
because
so
his life's just
beautiful.
taken a beautiful direction. We were talking the other day, I was like, with one of his business ventures, and I said, so what's the purpose behind this? And he went just like this. He flexed his muscle. He went just like this. He goes, everything in my life is about this. And I think once you have that voice
Yes.
speaking to you,
That's right.
and you start living your life in
That's
that
so good.
trajectory, it's so fulfilling. It's like you have that assurance, that certainty, that inner confidence that makes you courageous.
Yeah.
You know, he was like, I'm not going to go. He said, at this point in my life, I'm not going to college. That's not my path. All of my friends are going, and they're saying, what do you, he said, but I know what my path is, and I'm seeking that.
Because there are some decisions that you can make in your life that trump all other decisions.
Right.
So you make a decision early, at least in that, and for Jed, it's Matthew 6. It's Matthew 6. And now all decisions are weighed against that value. And I think that's what I love about this. So this value is so important to us. And I like that we're talking about it early in our value series because this is important to us.
Yeah.
I know it's important to you.
Yep.
You and I have been talking over the last year and praying and trusting God. And you've always said to me, when I get a word, when I get the voice, when I hear the voice, when I hear it, I'll know it. When I hear it, I'll know it. There's this value that we have as a community that before we do anything in life, I do this about almost anything. I joked this a few weeks ago with Jeff. You guys might have heard this story before, but I guess probably, 3 or 4, maybe 5 years ago, Jeff knew that God had put this city on our heart and partnered with Jeff on our hearts. And Jeff kept telling me, if you would do you trust God? Of course I trust God. What kind of question is that? Of course I trust God. Well, if you trust God, why don't you just sell everything you have and put the rest of it in a U-Haul and just come on out here? Don't you think God will take care of you? And I was like, I'm not sure I trust God that much. But the fact is, it was a few years later, I was doing just that. You do get to a place in your life where the options of hearing from God and trusting God and moving on that become fewer.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, we have one of our mentors says this to us frequently. You can't have faith, like divine faith, without a word.
That's right.
Faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word. You need a word. And when you get that word, the faith is there.
Yeah.
Like going back to Jed as an
Yeah.
example. Once he saw that, it was like, oh, I can step out in faith and do anything. And I think sometimes we're trying to muster up the faith. Abraham had the faith because he had the word. Take your son,
That's
your
right.
only son.
That's
Like,
right.
once you get a word, it doesn't matter what it is, your faith can kind of, and I think we're, especially in our Insta culture and our Insta society, we want everything now,
Sure.
quickly.
Sure.
We want to get rich quick. We want all these things. And a word from God requires patient listening.
Yeah.
And we don't have the time for that many times. It's like, I don't have time to listen.
Yeah.
Just send it to me and I'll do it.
That's right. That's right. What's on the gram?
Yeah.
What's on the gram?
Yeah.
I mean, it's all about Insta whatever. I recently, Jeff, heard someone say that prayer is the difference between the best we can do and the best that God can do. And I think that's that listening posture, right? It's like, that's the difference. It's standing in the middle of those two realities, the best you can do and the best God can do, and going, it is important to stop in the middle between those two realities and go, God, what is it you would have me do? And that's the difference.
And I think, like, how do we do this? I think one of the ways that we can enter into that how is not that we have to control whether the voice speaks or what the voice says.
Right.
All we have to be responsible for is the posture of, this is frequently what I'll say, I am open and receptive to whatever you would say.
Yes.
And if I don't hear, I just continue doing what I've been doing.
That's right. Just what I've been doing.
But if I hear, then there's this energy, there's this life, there's this, this sense, and I'll frequently just say, I am. I think the Hebrew word for listen, Shema, is a word that has within it the idea of listening with the desire to obey. There's an idea of listening with a desire to respond. I am listening with a desire to respond to what you would say. Not just, I am listening kind of like I would listen to my Spotify.
Right.
I'm listening because it makes me kind of joyful. But it's like, I want to respond to what you say.
Chemo in the chat earlier just said he wrote Shema on the wall of the garage in the Bayview.
Nice.
So
I love it, Chemo.
that's really good. Yeah, that's the posture I want to be.
Yeah.
And sometimes people view, I think, the posture of listening as a posture of inactivity. But that is not the truth.
No, it requires more intensity.
Yeah.
It requires more activity to be still.
That's right.
Than it does to be active.
That's right. That's right. So the question, so let me put in the chat here, I would love for you guys to just put out there and let us hear. Number one, if this is resonating with you, if there's something that you're hearing and sensing God, just say amen to that. But I really feel like that I want to encourage people, Jeff, from Rickard in Sweden to Jim in Arkansas, to our local Bay Area, and to all those in between. Like, God is speaking and we are listening for his voice. And when he speaks, we move.
Yeah.
We act.
Yep. I think, of course, a lot of you know, Jeff, and a lot of you know, the Gospel of John is certainly as a candy stick for me.
Sure.
And this motif of listening and hearing is woven throughout the Gospel of John. Jesus' disciples are those that hear.
That's right.
The crowd are those that just observe. But those that hear what he's saying, those are the real followers, all the way you get to John 10, and Jesus comes out right and says it. My sheep hear my voice. I call them by name.
That's right.
And there is that idea that part of that frequency of listening in it embodies this beautiful moment of realizing that you are known by God, that he knows you by name, that he calls you by name, and there is this deeply personal, intimate sense that my name is known by the Creator, and I think that, hearing that will recalibrate you for a lifetime.
I mean, it is this notion, Jeff, if there's other moments, please correct me. One of the early moments is how I'll posture this. One of the early moments where God's voice is recorded in Scripture is at creation, when he says, let there be.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I was thinking of that today. I'm glad you brought that up. Isn't that? I mean, the earth even responds to his voice.
That's right.
Chaos responds to his voice. The abyss responds to his voice. Light comes forth from darkness, order from chaos. You have all of this burgeoning, beautiful colors and the animation of the ocean, the animation of the air. Just let there be, and it happens. And then at the end of the day, it's like, this is good. So there's the sense of fulfillment, the sense of joy that even comes from the voice.
So because I thought of that this morning early, I Googled something about it. And here's what I learned about it. Embryologists now have discovered, Jeff, that the moment of conception with new life, that when this is when sperm meets egg, that there are millions of zinc particles released in flashes of light. that have been now caught and visually seen by embryologists, which mirrors the fact that when God spoke, let there be light, light and darkness separated. And it just illustrates that happening inside of us is this gene of creation that's in us from the voice of God.
Yeah. Don't get me started. Don't get me started. I'm going to go to preaching.
I mean, listening to the voice of God is something, this is something that you will hear Jeff say, you'll hear me say. I'm always, what does God say?
Yeah.
What does God say?
And I think, one of the ways that you can, once you hear something, finding ways to symbolize that, finding ways to repeat that, finding ways to, I've been saying this ad nauseum. In our Sunday times of just every hour my affirmation song coming on.
Right.
There are so many things in that I'm affirming that were words that I received, and I just speak. I give voice.
Right.
It's like I want to be an echo of what I'm hearing and sensing God say. I just want to echo it in my life, reverberate it out. This will be, even in the face, and you see this with Abraham, you see this with people of faith, even in the face of difficulty or challenge, I want my heart to rest in the truth that I know that I am, that God is in me and through me.
What is God saying to you? And I assure you that if you will listen, God will speak. And in your life, whatever you're dealing with right now in your life, Jeff, this is what I feel in my spirit, is that God is going to affirm to you that He is listening to your prayers, and that you are listening for His voice, and God is going to speak in every arena of your life. Be encouraged today. You should put your shoulders back a little bit, smile a little bit, and just be confident of this thing that God is going to speak, and it's going to change everything. It's going to change everything for you. Well, we're going to move into our worship segment. And while we do that, I would love you to, as you're listening to the worship, begin to process kind of a listening prayer posture, listening for God in your life. And as you're hearing things, if there's things you're hearing, I would encourage you to put them in the chat. And Jeff and I are going to be in the chat with you, processing with you and praying with you and worshiping with you. And Jeff, would you just pray over the community and push us into this moment of prayer?
Yeah. Right where you are, would you just breathe in deeply, and just hold it there for a moment, like that bated breath, and now just exhale. One more time. Oh, great artist of voice and sky, creator of all that was and is and will come, lover of our soul, peacemaker, truth revealer. We posture our hearts towards you. We are open. We are receptive to whatever you would say to us. Speak, Lord. Your servants hear with a desire to respond. In your silence, may there be glorious life, words, hope, joy. We are yours. As we listen to songs of worship and praise, our hearts are tuning in to the frequency of your beloved voice, singing over us. Thank you for offering to us Jesus as one who hears God, speaks on God's behalf, and shows us that we are sheep, beloved and known by our King.